Welcome to the Plainview Church of Christ and our mini-series on the Christian and mental health, or Christian dealing with mental illness. We've talked about some mood disorders, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about personality disorders. This is really, really hard material because discovering the difference between people who literally struggle with these things and people who have maladaptive patterns. And I guess I probably need to try to talk about maladaptive patterns. In general terms, I'll make the exception with substance abuse. In general terms, all human behavior is reward motivated. I do what I do the way I do it because on some level it works for me. And we'll grant the idea that somewhere in your past you had to have this behavior, and that behavior allowed you to survive an unpleasant or an untenable situation, and it had a survival, an adaptive mechanism to it because you're here. You made it. Congratulations, you made it to this point in time. But when you left that environment and you continue to use that strategy, that adaptive behavior now becomes maladaptive. The hardest thing in dealing with personality disorders, and that again is a personality disorder, are those persons who struggle and have a difficulty in relationships with relationships. And you'll notice that in their past, there's a series of broken relationships. Those kinds of behaviors are sometimes so ingrained as to be unconscious in us. Sometimes those behaviors are so part of how we've learned to deal with our environment that we really aren't really aware of their bad effects, which takes us into, do these people have a full understanding of their emotions? Not only do they have a full understanding of their emotions, but do they have the insight to look at, hey, I've always responded this way to something, and that may not be healthy. Sometimes when people say, that's just the way I am, or I've always been this way, really what they mean is, I do this, I get the same results, I don't like it, but I really don't know why. And so when we talk about dealing with personality disorders, it's very, very hard to differentiate and know which one of these are actual chemical imbalances and which one of these are maladaptive behaviors. So let's just describe some of the symptomology and some of the things that we can do in dealing with them. It's interesting enough that in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 10, David has been a warrior. And he flees from King Saul because Saul has now threatened his life. And David does something really irrational, it seems. He goes over to the camp of the enemy. He leaves Israel and he goes over to the Philistines. In 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 10, the Bible says, now that day David fled from Saul, and he went to Achish, the king of Gath. Gath is the hometown of Goliath. You have 5 major Philistine cities. Gath was a hometown boy. David has the reputation as the guy who killed Goliath. In fact, David, unless he's changed, is carrying the battle sword of Goliath, because that's the sword he took from Abimelech the priest when he ran from Saul on one of the first occasions. And so David goes to the hometown of the slain battle champion that David's responsible for killing to align himself or either to hide from Saul. So that day David fled from Saul and he went to Achish, the king of Gath. The servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. David shows up in the city of Gath, and these guys think he's the king. Why do they think he's the king? They think he's the king because he's the most powerful warrior. They said, listen, we've heard this guy's music on the radio. And when they sing about this guy, they sing that Saul has slain thousands, David has slain 10,000s. And so they're telling this king, look, this guy who showed up on your doorstep is the guy that they write this poetry about and celebrate in their war dances because he's a celebrated, decorated war hero. David hears this. David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their presence, in their hands, he acted like a madman. He made marks on the doors of the gate, and he let saliva run down his beard. And Achish says to his king, to his servants, look, the man is insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? David worries about what this guy is going to do to him. David worries about, did my reputation precede me, and are they somehow going to respond to me in a way that says, you know what, this guy has killed enough of our warriors, he's not going to kill anymore. What does he do to survive this situation? He feigns madness. He acts as if he's got some kind of disorder, and he scratches at the door, and he scratches at the gate, he makes marks on the wall, and he lets saliva trickle down his beard. And the response the king has to him is, look, are we lower madmen? Am I short of people that I've got to watch this guy behave like this? The difficult part of understanding personality disorders is whether or not this is behavior that somebody can help, or this is behavior that is either unconscious, non-conscious behavior, or whether or not this is behavior that people choose to use to manipulate, control, or abuse us. I have not found anybody who can say, here's a list of diagnosis, here's a list of symptomology, here's a list of behaviors, here's a circumstance that makes me able to say, hey, this person is consciously or non-consciously choosing to behave this way versus this person has some kind of mechanism going on in their brain that they can't help but act this way. I don't know how to tell the difference between somebody who has a deficit versus somebody who doesn't have the capacity. So what you've got to figure out is, let's grant, first of all, that this may be some kind of maladaptive behavior. Let's grant that this behavior could be controlled. How does this behavior help this person? And where does this behavior come from? In the book, Beyond Logic, Consequences, and Control, is the theory that there's only two primary emotions. The two primary emotions are love and fear. All bad behavior comes from fear. It may be that we run into people who behave in ways that make them very difficult to understand and very difficult to deal with them. Rather than asking, hey, what's wrong with you? We may need to compassionately ask, hey, what happened to you? Because so many times, people who have unfortunate circumstances develop a way of relating to the world that is self-preserving, that is self-protecting. A child who suffers from reactive attachment disorder may lie with the ease of a sociopath. But if you recognize that in the family of origin that he came from, lying was a matter of survival, he'll lie about anything because in trauma, that which is similar feels the same. And so if this person feels like, hey, if I don't get by with this lie, I'm going to get beaten or punished or put in a closet, they will lie about little bitty dumb things, not because the little bitty dumb thing they're talking about is important, but because there's an implicit idea that I have to lie to survive. We tend to respond to the lie more than we respond to the trauma that could have produced the lie. Looking at people with compassion, very hard. At the same time that you look at people with compassion, we also have to understand that in some cases, people who are irrational and people who are emotionally unstable do have the ability to become toxic and make the environment around us toxic. I'd like to read a passage from some other writers who are a little smarter than I am. Dr. Mark Goldston is a corporate psychologist. He's also a hostage negotiator. He's the author of the book Just Listen, and also the author of the book Talking to Crazy. He lists several types of people that we need to be careful when we interact with, as far as whether or not their personalities are damaging or toxic to us. In his book, Talking to Crazy, he means irrational people, not mentally ill people. These people have pervasive, lifelong, systemic difficulties in relating to others. And here's kind of the summary that he gives them. Emotional people. Emotional people believe they need to vent or they'll explode. Therefore, they cry, they scream, they slam doors. They tend to overpower other people because they're willing to escalate a situation to a point that's unbearable for a sane person. It's here where they control us by making us feel responsible for controlling their outburst. If you can put me in a position where I feel like I've got to control your mood, then you're controlling me in reality. Second type people that Dr. Goldston talks about are the logical/practical people. These people think they're in control only when they stick to the facts. As a result, they become terse, cold, and condescending. You may start feeling and acting more emotional and angry in response to their icy logic. They also have a way of causing you to feel ashamed for simply having feelings. These people lack insight or intuition, and they tend to be very rigid, very demanding, and very legalistic. Other types of maladaptive personalities are the manipulative or the needy. These people whine, wheedle, and make excuses to get something from others that they can't or won't supply for themselves. If you don't give them what they want, often they try to control you by making you feel guilty. These people are unrelenting. You may start to feel annoyed and put upon. Dr. Goldston says, I often refer to these type folks as victims or those with learned helplessness. They feign a lack of autonomy in order to maintain control over you. I can't help this, you've got to do this for me. I can't make friends with these people, you've got to let me in your social circle. I can't do this. And their feign of helplessness actually gives them lots of control over you. Fearful people. Fearful people act like they're constantly surrounded by threats. They are prone to lashing out wildly when someone triggers their fear. They appear to be comfortably perched between panic and fear. They evoke a nearly constant need for you to reassure them, and that eventually gets exhausting on your part. The self-efficacy or the ability for self-regulation is controlling that impulse to react to fear and run away or panic. Then you have people whose personalities are hopeless or withdrawn. These people feel like the world will only hurt them, so they hide from it. No matter how hard you try to convince them that they can be happy in the future, they'll insist that you're wrong. Their negativity can leave you feeling frustrated, sad, and even hopeless yourself. Then you have a group of people that Dr. Goldston calls martyrs. Martyrs make a point of refusing to ask for help, even when they desperately need it. They initially make you feel guilty for not helping, despite not giving you a chance. Over time, however, their martyr act can make you feel exasperated. Then you have bullies. Bullies believe they're in control only if they're making you feel intimidated and weak. That's why they attack, that's why they threaten, and that's why they belittle you. Bullies sometimes fit the characteristic of a narcissist. The more powerless you feel, the more powerful they feel. Bullying people make you submissive as well as angry. You may be provoked to strike back, which then allows them to say, see, you're acting irrationally. See, you're acting bad. See, you're acting with all this anger, and I wouldn't have treated you that way, but you did this to me first. And that's the way the bully's mode of operation is. Then you have folks that are know-it-alls. They like being the only expert on a topic, even if they've never been there or done that. They will find cracks in any idea you offer. They know that if they make you feel stupid, you'll lose confidence. These people make you feel insignificant and sometimes ashamed of yourself, and that eventually builds resentfulness. And then you have a group of people that are sociopathic. Sociopathic people, they're technically sane, but irrational in a unique way, and they're hiding secrets. Their MO is to terrify you so that you won't find out what those secrets are, or worse, expose them to the rest of the world. These people make you afraid. You get around them, you even kind of feel creeped out. I call it having your spider sense tingle. When you get around those kind of people, be aware. In fact, another author on this subject, a guy named Joe Navarro, is an FBI profiler. He wrote the book Dangerous Personalities. And he basically talks about these personality types. And instead of talking about, the typical diagnostic criterion, he says dangerous personalities are the narcissist, the predator, the paranoid, and the unstable. An in-depth technical definition of these folks would take us too long, but just remember that when people control you and they make you feel powerless, helpless, or trapped, you can be forced into certain positions or scenarios against your will. Being controlled may also result in you being prevented from moving at all. When people manipulate you is when you make choices, but they're not free choices. The choices are reactions rather than responses, and it may be that manipulation puts us in a position where we feel as if we only have two choices and they're both bad. And then abuse is when a person has the ability and chooses to hurt us. Control and manipulation are mild forms of abuse, but here we're talking about not allowing somebody access or ability to actually harm you. Joe Beam, the host of Marriage 911 or Marriage Helper, talks about damage in the areas, and he calls it PIES, P-I-E-S, physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. If someone hurts you in any of those areas, then you're in a position to set some limits and avoid those kind of people. So when we talk about personality disorders, we're really talking about people who are irrational or emotionally unstable. They probably can't help it but are unaware that the level of their dysfunction, or maybe they're like David and they're aware of the dysfunction, but you know what? I get some secondary gains. I get the ability to live in this way. I get the ability to act this way and not be held accountable for my behavior. At any point that a person can make you responsible for something you don't control, they've gained an unhealthy advantage in your life. And at any point that a person can make you feel like they control something that doesn't belong to them, your happiness, your success, your autonomy, your spirituality, your competency, those are folks that with personality disorders are folks that would probably be deemed as not just dangerous, but toxic as well, and we need to kind of avoid those folks. The really hard part of dealing with folks who deal with some struggle with some type of personality disorder is reaching that conclusion that says, hey, here's somebody who can't help what they're doing versus here's somebody who's making either conscious or non-conscious choices to adopt this behavior. And the only real way to respond to that is with some loving limits and some loving consequences. Remember, in Romans chapter 12, he says, as much as possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. It may be that attaining peace with these people means not having anything to do with them. It may be setting some limits or making some choices. It may be as difficult as saying, hey, we can interact, but you don't spend the night at my house, I don't spend the night at your house. We meet at restaurants. That way, if somebody needs to leave or disengage, it's not some kind of a big scene where you're packing stuff up and packing the car and leaving. It may be, we could come to family events, but we're going to stay in a hotel, not under your roof. It may be that, you can come to our family events, but you need to stay in a hotel, not under our roof. That way, there's not always some kind of drama of somebody, I'm just going to leave, I'm going to bail out, I'm going to do whatever. These people tend to make us feel responsible for their moods. They tend to make us feel responsible for things that we don't control. They tend to make us fearful of their reactions. And at any point that I'm using my reaction to something to control you, it probably belies the fact that I have more control over this than maybe that you would think I would have. And that causes a situation where that person then is being manipulative, they're being controlling, or just being outright abusive. Part of the discussion, at least in my mind, of personality issues, people who have struggle or trouble with relationships, comes in the form of people who are abusing substances. Substance abuse and substance addiction is almost always comorbid or exist together with some kind of mental illness or some kind of altered mental state. Now, substance abuse is probably present in over 50% of all suicides. What happens with substance abuse behavior is these people have either a codependent personality or a dependent personality, a manipulative personality, a victim personality, a martyr personality, or a know-it-all personality. And that personality supports or holds up their substance, or their substance use supports or holds up that personality. It's kind of hard to tell. Substance abuse basically is that they're using some kind of chemical to change and alter their own reality. Now, either they're trying to create feelings that they don't have, or they're trying to stop feelings that they do have. The interesting thing about the substance abuse is, if addiction is sinful because it violates some things that God talks about with self-control, then I have a hard time calling it a disease. Remember, God's not going to hold you accountable for that which you are not responsible. And so at some point, we've got to decide what we're going to do with this. For years, we've been taught that brain chemistry is so powerful and so strong that your dopamine receptors and those kind of things, that once a person gets hooked on the drug, they're hooked. Well, brain chemistry has a very, very strong influence in addiction, but it's not the entire story. Brain chemistry is only part of the story. Lots of people take, medical grade heroin after surgeries, and they don't come out of the hospital addicted. A lot of people take pain pills after a surgery, after a dental procedure, and they don't end up, addicted to opiates. There's something that the use of the substance gets linked with some kind of fear, some kind of feeling of helplessness, some kind of feeling of trapped, some kind of feeling of loss, some kind of a trauma connection. Because if there's a feeling of inadequacy, there's something that I need to start or something I need to stop, and I get it associated with this chemical, then that bond between this feeling and this chemical goes beyond the parameters of behaviorism. See, you can't take a person who's addicted to a substance and put them in jail long enough, beat them hard enough, or take enough stuff away from them to cause them to say, nah, I'm not going to do that anymore. Their default is that they always return to that. Why? Because it's doing something for them on a deeper level than just behavior. And it's really, really hard to understand how strongly ingrained our behaviors are, our response and stimulus and response. Those are super powerful mechanisms in humans. And yet, people who struggle with substance abuse or substance addictions, they go beyond that model, because going beyond that model means that they're really not worried about consequences. If bad consequences eliminated addiction, nobody would be addicted, because it always has bad consequences. We did, I think, a Wednesday night here several years ago on addiction, so I'm not going to revisit a lot of that. But understanding the idea that addictive behavior always comes from a sense of inadequacy, some sense of powerlessness, some sense of helplessness, some sense of being trapped, or some sense of being controlled. Read Lance Dodes, D-O-D-E-S, Lance Dodes in his book, The Heart of Addiction, or his book, Breaking Addiction, and look at the trauma connection between addictive behavior, substance use behavior, and the ways that addiction responds to itself. The biggest thing for me when talking about addictions is an experiment that was called Rat Park. The idea behind this experiment goes back to a classic experiment where they put white rats in a cage, and the white rat had access to two water tubes. One water tube was just pure water, and water tube was laced with a substance, either cocaine or heroin. I think it was cocaine. And the rat in the cage with the two choices would almost always compulsively drink the drug-laced water and drink it to the point they would die. And you could repeat that experiment until you ran out of rats. A guy named Bruce Anderson comes along and says, what if it's not about the chemical? What if it's about the cage? And so he builds this big, elaborate cage that he called Rat Park. And in Rat Park, he had colored balls and cheese and wheels and tunnels and female rats. And you had a tube of water and a tube of water laced with some narcotic, whether it was cocaine or heroin. The rats in Rat Park don't use the heroin water or the cocaine water. The rats in Rat Park, when they do use it, don't use it compulsively, and there's never been an overdose of that substance in Rat Park. Because the rats who are connected, the rats who have interaction, the rats who have activities, the rats who are not suffering from deprivation of purpose, somehow don't end up addicted to the substance or addicted to the chemical. If it's just the chemical produces these brain hooks and they cause you to be an automaton and you can't stay away from that, Rat Park proves that's something very different. Rat Park proves that the biggest part of addiction is self-acceptance. Now, we've talked about self-understanding, but self-understanding and self-acceptance, knowing who I am, knowing who I'm not, and being willing to accept that, living under certain parameters with my self-regulation. What can I do with what I've got? Delayed gratification, impulse control, the things that we talk about. It's very, very important to understand that oftentimes people who are using substances are trying to create feelings that they don't think they can have, or trying to stop feelings that they get because somebody else gave them to them. So many times in an addictive cycle, you'll find people who say, hey, I really believe there's just something inherently wrong with me. I believe I'm broken from the factory, and if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me. And if you really knew me, you wouldn't like me, so I'm going to have to live in a world where I can't be authentic, and I can't be genuine, and I can't be vulnerable. Well, if I'm not being genuine and authentic and vulnerable, then I don't think you are either, so I can't trust you to meet my needs, and so I have to meet my own needs. And the one thing that never fails to meet my needs is this substance I've become bonded to. So many times in addictions, we use substances to shut out bad feelings. But the thing about human emotion is it's one big switch, not a bunch of little breaker panels. And when you put fear or anxiety or something else to sleep, you also put love and joy and happiness to sleep. Brene Brown, in commenting on the Rat Park experiment, or at least in her discussions about shame, says that shame is the fear of loss of connections. And people who are struggling with substance abuse issues often feel like, for whatever reason, they are inadequate for themselves, and they're inadequate to be connected or accepted to other people, and they live in a world where masks are worn by everybody, and because they can't have transparency and vulnerability, they self-medicate, they self-isolate, they self-insulate to take care of themselves. In dealing with substance abuse issues, it's probably more important not to ask, hey, what's wrong with you, but to ask, hey, what happened to you? It's very, very difficult to ferret out. And we talk about personality disorders, you talk about substance abuse disorders, whether this is something that can't be controlled or whether it is something that through non-conscious processes has become adaptive behavior. I guess my thought on this goes back to Romans 12. As much as possible, as much as it depends on you, live at peace with all men. But if the exposure to these people costs you spiritually, puts you in danger of losing your soul, causes there to be disharmony among the children. And by the way, trauma in the lives of small children have echoing effects throughout their adulthood. It's not causal, but it's correlated. At some point, you may have to say, look, this is a situation where we can't deal with the toxicity. Paul talks about leavening the lump, affecting the entire church. Well, I believe that's a principle that's true for churches. I believe that's a principle that's true for communities. I believe it's a principle that's true for families. And in some cases, you may not be able to say, hey, this is something that can't be controlled, or this is something that can be controlled, but you have to put some limits and say, as long as this behavior manifests, as long as the dose toxicity is present, then we're going to have to choose not to have something to do with you. We're going to have to choose to put some limits on the access you have to us, the access you have to the children, the access you have to whatever. It's very unfortunate we can't just black and white go, yeah, this is this and this is that. But sometimes God gives us a spirit of discernment, gives us an understanding that in some cases, if this is going to affect the entire system, we got to be very careful. Not an example probably in context, but you've got a guy in the city of Corinth who's living in an immoral state with his father's wife. And Paul says, look, you really need to make a choice. You either continue with this woman and be a member of the church, or you be a member of the church and don't continue with this woman. And those behaviors weren't meant to be punitive. Those behaviors weren't meant to be vindictive. Those behaviors were meant to place some consequences on behavior. Now, when you place consequences on behavior and people can't rationally choose between those consequences, they're probably truly mentally ill. They probably do have an indigenous condition and don't possess the capacity. But in either case, when they can't be responsible for their behaviors and danger and toxicity exist, then I believe it's well within the parameters of the Christian to set some limits and protect innocent people from toxic behavior.